They called her a liability. Not out loud. The Montreal Syndicate had manners, or at least the performance of them. But Sylvie Cournoyer heard it in the silence that dropped over the room when she walked in. She heard it in the way the men at the long mahogany table stopped their conversations mid-sentence, glanced at her, and then looked away with that particular blankness that meant they'd already formed a conclusion and saw no reason to revisit it. She was 31 years old, 5'4", and wore a size 18 blazer she'd had tailored because off-the-rack never fit properly across the shoulders. Her hair was dark and cut practically short. She carried a leather folio under one arm and a coffee in her other hand, and she sat down at the far end of the table without being invited to sit anywhere in particular. Dominic Archambault noticed all of this. He noticed most things. It was how he had stayed alive this long. And what he noticed about Sylvie Cournoyer was that she didn't apologize for the space she took up. Not with her posture, not with her eyes, not with any of the small concessions women sometimes made in rooms full of men who hadn't invited them. He filed that away. The meeting was about the Levesque matter. 3 shipments had gone sideways in 6 weeks, and someone at the table was either incompetent or on someone else's payroll. Dominic didn't know which yet, but he was going to find out. And the woman at the end of the table, a forensic accountant his lawyer had recommended with some reluctance, as though the quality of her work was somehow embarrassing given the packaging, was apparently the one who was going to help him. What followed was 40 minutes of the most precise financial deconstruction Dominic had ever witnessed. She didn't use the presentation she'd prepared. She looked at it once, set it aside, and spoke from memory, which meant she'd done this so many times the numbers had simply become language to her. She pointed to 2 men at the table by name, not accusation, just fact, and explained exactly how their expense reports had been structured to conceal a parallel cash flow that led, with elegant clarity, to a numbered account in the Cayman Islands. The 2 men went very still. The room went very quiet. Dominic looked at Sylvie Cournoyer, and she was looking at him, waiting to see what he would do next, and there was nothing in her expression that suggested she was afraid of the answer. He decided then that he had a problem, because she was already walking out the door. The arrangement was his lawyer's idea, framed as a business proposition, and delivered with the kind of careful language that meant it wasn't entirely a request. The Levesque situation had exposed certain vulnerabilities. There were parties, rivals, creditors, enemies of various vintages, who would move quickly if they believed Dominic was weakened. A marriage would signal stability. A wife would signal roots. His lawyer had several candidates in mind. Women of appropriate background, appropriate appearance, appropriate willingness. Dominic said he wanted Sylvie Cournoyer. His lawyer paused for a long time. "She's not," he started. "I know what she is," Dominic said. "Set up the meeting." She met him at a cafe on Rue Saint-Denis because she'd named the location, which he found interesting. She arrived 7 minutes early, which he found more interesting. She ordered a croque-monsieur and ate it without apology while he explained the situation, and when he was finished she wiped her hands on a napkin and looked at him steadily. "Why me?" she said. "It wasn't quite a question. Because I need someone I can trust in the house," he said, "and I trust competence more than I trust loyalty. That's a very sad thing to trust. It's kept me alive." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the street was wet and grey in the way Montreal got in late October, slush on the curbs and the sky pressing down low. She'd grown up in this city. She knew its moods. "I have conditions," she said. "I expected you would. My own schedule, my own work. I keep my clients." "Fine, I want it in writing, that this ends in 2 years, cleanly with no financial entanglement. Also fine. And I want you to understand," she said, leaning forward, slightly. "I am not going to stand next to you and look pleasant while men like the ones at your table last week pretend I'm not in the room. If that's what you need, I am not your solution." Dominic looked at her for a moment. "The men at my table last week," he said, "are no longer my problem." Sylvie picked up her coffee. "Then we have a deal," she said. The wedding was a small thing by Syndicate standards, which meant it was only somewhat excessive. 50 guests, a private room at a restaurant in Old Montreal, champagne that cost more per bottle than Sylvie's first car. She wore a navy dress she'd bought herself and had her hair done by the woman who'd been cutting it for 8 years, who asked no questions and charged her regular rate. The guests were polite. That was the word she'd choose. Polite. The women kissed her cheeks and complimented her dress in voices that stopped just short of warmth. The men shook her hand with the particular firmness of men, demonstrating that they were taking her seriously, which was its own kind of condescension. One man, older, heavy-set himself, with a grey moustache and the bearing of someone who had once held more power than he currently did, leaned in and said, close enough that she could smell the scotch, "He could have had anyone, you know." Sylvie looked at him. "He did," she said pleasantly, and turned away. She heard later that he'd told the story twice that evening, both times as a joke at her expense. The punchline was something about Dominic's taste. She filed it away the way she filed everything, neatly, with dates, in a place she could retrieve it later. The house was in Westmount, stone and 3 stories, with a garden that looked beautiful in the summer and was currently full of dead leaves no one had raked. There was a housekeeper named Giselle who had been with Dominic for 11 years and regarded Sylvie with the careful neutrality of someone who had outlasted several arrangements and expected to outlast this one too. There was a security detail of 4 men rotating in pairs, and a 5th man named Francois who served as Dominic's driver and was somewhat more than that. There was an office on the 2nd floor that Dominic used, and a smaller room at the back of the house with good light that Giselle, without being asked, had set up with a desk and a lamp and a small bookshelf. Sylvie moved her things in on a Tuesday. It took 2 trips. She and Dominic fell into a pattern that was less a marriage than a professional partnership with shared real estate. They had dinner together 3 or 4 times a week. He asked good questions and listened to the answers. She found, to her surprise, that she didn't dread the evenings. "You were a sniper," she said one night, over Giselle's cassoulet, because she'd found the reference in a file she hadn't been meant to see and decided the honest thing was to simply say so. Dominic was quiet for a moment. "A long time ago," he said. "Before the Syndicate, before a lot of things." She nodded and ate her cassoulet. He refilled her wine without being asked. "You used to hunt," he said. "Your father." She looked up. "That's in a file somewhere." "Your lawyer was thorough with the background check. There was a note about a hunting camp in the Laurentians, summers, when you were a child. He taught me to shoot," she said. "Rifle, mostly. I was good at it. I stopped when he died." She paused. "I was better at the numbers anyway." He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before and couldn't quite name. "Probably," he said. "Yes." The tension inside the Syndicate, Sylvie understood, was structural. Dominic had inherited leadership from his uncle 5 years ago, and there were men who had wanted that inheritance for themselves and had been waiting, with the particular patience of grudge holders, for an opportunity to revisit the question. The Levesque situation had been their attempt. It hadn't worked, in part because of Sylvie, which meant she was now a variable they needed to account for. She knew this the way she knew everything, from the numbers. Expense reports that stopped lining up, communication patterns she'd mapped from phone logs she technically wasn't supposed to have access to, but that Dominic had left on his desk one afternoon in the way that a man leaves things when he wants someone to find them without having to ask. She built a picture over 6 weeks. It was a careful picture, the kind that could hold up under questioning. 3 men, old family, old grudges, a new alliance with a rival organization out of Toronto that had been moving into Quebec territory for 2 years. She put it in a folder and left it on Dominic's desk on a Wednesday evening. By Thursday morning, she could tell by the particular quality of his silence that he'd read it. He didn't say anything about it directly. That wasn't how he operated. But at dinner that night, he looked at her across the table with something that might, in a different kind of story, have been the beginning of something. Giselle made tarte tatin. he said. "I know," said Sylvie. "I can smell it from here." The trip to the lake house was Francois's idea, framed as a security precaution. Things were moving, he said, with the careful vagueness of a man who knew more than he was saying. Better for Dominic to be out of the city for a few days, lower profile. The property in the eastern townships 3 hours southeast. Dominic's grandfather had built it in the 50s, and it had been in the family since, which meant the location was known, but the layout wasn't, and the surrounding property was large enough that approach couldn't be silent. Dominic agreed. Francois drove them up on a Friday afternoon, the highway giving way to the 2-lane roads that wove between the hills and the bare autumn maples, the sky enormous and pale above the lake. It was, Sylvie thought, genuinely beautiful. She'd spent very little time in the countryside. She stood on the dock for a long time after they arrived, looking at the water, which was still and the color of pewter. "You should get some sleep," Dominic said from behind her. "I don't sleep well when I'm working something through," she said. "You're always working something through." "Yes," she agreed. "I am." He stood beside her on the dock for a few minutes. The lake made small sounds. Somewhere in the tree line, a bird said something once and was quiet. "The folder," he said. "Yes, the third name. He's the one who built the connection to Toronto," she said. "The other two are followers. He's the one who decided." Dominic was quiet for a moment. "How certain are you?" 94%, she said. "I don't do 100. 100 means you stopped looking." He made a sound that might have been a laugh, very brief. "Get some sleep," he said again. She did, eventually, in the bedroom at the back of the house that smelled of cedar and old summers. She slept with the window open a crack, because she always did, and she heard the lake moving, and she didn't dream. Dominic left the next morning before she woke, which she understood. There were things that needed to happen in the city, and he couldn't make them happen from a dock in the eastern townships. Francois drove him. He'd left 2 men at the house, a quiet one named Sebastien, who read crime novels in the kitchen, and a younger one named Patrick, who paced. She spent the morning working at the kitchen table, spreadsheets open, Giselle's coffee cake from the freezer defrosted and eaten over the sink because there were no appropriate plates, and she wasn't going to dirty a serving dish for one person. She was 3 hours into a reconciliation of 6 months of procurement records when Sebastien looked up from his book. He didn't say anything. He just looked up, and then he was very still, and Sylvie understood from that stillness alone that something was wrong. She closed her laptop. The front door was at the far end of the hall. The back door was 6 feet to her left, through the mudroom, which was also where the hunting equipment was stored. She'd seen it when she was looking for extra blankets the night before. Old gear, a grandfather's accumulation fishing rods, waders, a locked cabinet. A locked cabinet, she'd noted, with a key in the lock. Sebastien was on his feet, hand inside his jacket, when the front window shattered. Sylvie was already in the mudroom. She had been 11 years old the first time her father had taken her to the camp in the Laurentians. He was a practical man, her father a civil engineer who believed in teaching useful things, and the most useful thing he knew was that the world did not, in fact, care whether you were ready for it. You just had to be faster at deciding than it was at arriving. She had that voice in her head now, very clearly, in his exact tone. Stop thinking about what's happening. Think about what needs to happen. Rifle, bolt action, older than she was, and a box of ammunition that was, mercifully, not expired. Her hands remembered the motions before her brain caught up with the decision. Safety off. She heard 1 shot inside the house. Then quiet. 1 shot inside the house. More than 1 person, moving too carefully to be Sebastien or Patrick. There was a window in the mudroom, high and narrow, that looked out onto the side yard. She looked through it and counted 3 men. From the front, one of them already inside. She thought about Dominic, 3 hours away, who had left her here with 2 guards and not quite enough information, and who had eaten Giselle's cassoulet across the table from her and refilled her wine without being asked. She thought about 94%, And the third name. Then she stopped thinking and started working. The first one came through the mudroom door 4 minutes later, which was longer than she'd expected, which meant they were being careful, which meant they knew she wasn't helpless, which meant someone had told them about the folder. She was behind the chest freezer. The angle wasn't ideal. She took it anyway. The second one she heard before she saw. He'd gone around the outside of the house, which was tactically sound, and come in through the broken window on the east side. She moved through the kitchen in her socks. Giselle would have disapproved of the state of the floor, and caught him on his way through the living room, which had 2 large armchairs that created a natural funnel if you were approaching from the east and didn't know the house. He didn't know the house. She did. She'd spent the evening before memorizing it, the way she memorized things, because that was simply what she did with spaces she inhabited. The third one was the problem. He was still outside and he'd stopped moving, which meant he'd heard the inside go quiet and was reassessing. She waited for 3 full minutes at the back door, counting her breaths the way her father had taught her, and then she opened it. He was at the tree line, 20 meters out, scanning the house. The .308 was a deer rifle. It was accurate at 200 meters in good conditions. 20 meters in still air on a clear November morning was not a difficult shot. She stood in the doorway and made it. The quiet afterward was different from the quiet before. She'd noticed that the first time, her father, at the camp, after the shot. The world didn't go back to what it was. It went to something adjacent, something that looked similar but had a different texture. She went back inside and found Patrick behind the couch in the living room, alive, with a gash on his head and someone else's blood on his jacket, trying to figure out what had happened. She told him, briefly. He stared at her. "You did all 3, he said. "Sebastian," she said. "Kitchen." He said, He stopped. "He's going to be okay." It got his shoulder. She nodded. She went to the kitchen and looked at Sebastian, who was pale and sitting against the cabinets with his hand pressed to his shoulder and his crime novel still on the table, face down to keep the page. "You should call Dominic," said Sebastian. She found Dominic's number and called it. He picked up on the second ring. "There was a team," she said. "3 men. It's handled. Sebastian needs a hospital." There was a silence. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." Another silence, different from the first. "I'm coming back," he said. "You don't have to, Sylvie," he said. She stopped. "I'm coming back," he said again, more quietly. She sat down at the kitchen table. The laptop was still there, the spreadsheet still open, the procurement records in 6 neat columns. Outside, the lake was still silver and still. A heron crossed the tree line at the far shore, unhurried. "The third name," she said. "He sent them." "I know. 94%, she said. "I know," he said again. "I'm on my way." She hung up and looked at Sebastian, who was looking at her with an expression she recognized from the men at the table months ago, but inverted, not the blankness of a conclusion already reached, but the openness of someone revising one. "Your father taught you to hunt?" he said. "Yes," she said. "What did you hunt?" She thought about this. "Deer," she said. "Mostly. He said the patience was the thing. The shot is easy. The waiting is the skill." Sebastian considered this for a long moment, his hand still pressed to his shoulder. "Good teacher," he said. Dominic arrived before the ambulance, which said something about Francois driving. He came through the front door and went through the house in less than 90 seconds, accounting for everything, and then he found her at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she'd made, because there was nothing else useful to do while waiting, and her hands had needed something to hold. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. "Your socks," he said. She looked down. There was blood on the left one, someone else's, from the living room. "Giselle's floors were clean," she said. "I'm sorry about the floors." He crossed the kitchen and sat down across from her, which was where he sat at dinner, which felt strange and correct at the same time. He looked at her for a long moment with that expression she hadn't been able to name before, on the dock the night before, watching the pewter lake. She could name it now. It was the look of a man who had stopped being surprised and started paying attention. "You're not going to tell me I should have run," she said. or hidden. No, he said, because I could have. The back of the property is wooded. I probably had enough time, but you didn't. They interrupted my reading, she said simply, and Dominic Archambault, who had been running the Montreal Syndicate for 5 years and had not laughed at anything in a manner he couldn't control since approximately 2019, laughed. It was a real laugh, short and startled, like something that had escaped without permission. Sylvie picked up her tea. Also, she said more quietly, they were going to come back, or someone else was. And I'm very tired of problems I can see coming and can't be allowed to address. He was watching her again. You can address them, he said. That's a significant thing to offer. You're a significant person, he said, with the directness of a man who had, at some point in the past 48 hours, simply stopped pretending otherwise. Outside, the ambulance arrived. Francois knocked on the doorframe to let them know. The heron was back on the far shore, or maybe a different heron, impossible to tell at this distance, standing perfectly still at the edge of the water, waiting with the patience of something that understood exactly how much time it had. The third name was dealt with the following week, through channels Sylvie didn't ask about and didn't need to. The Toronto alliance collapsed without its architect. The two followers made the particular kind of decision that men make when the alternative is worse, and the Montreal Syndicate went back to the slow, ongoing work of being itself. The 2-year clause remained in the agreement. Sylvie kept her clients, kept her schedule, kept the small office at the back of the house with the good light. Giselle continued to make cassoulet and tarte tatin, and once a remarkably good tourtière that Sylvie ate 2 helpings of without comment. One evening in December, Dominic came to the doorway of her office. He knocked, that there was a situation developing in Vancouver that he thought she might want to look at. She turned from her screen. What kind of situation? She said. Financial, he said. Complex. Someone's moving money in a pattern that doesn't match the stated business. She considered him in the doorway. That's my area, she said. Yes, he said. That's why I'm asking. She turned back to her screen, saved her work, and closed the laptop. Pour me a glass of wine, she said, and tell me what you know. He went downstairs. She listened to the sound of the house around her. Giselle's television at low volume from the kitchen, the particular creak of the 3rd stair that she'd learned in the first week, the way the heating system knocked once at 9 o'clock every evening, like someone politely requesting entry. She went downstairs. He was at the table, 2 glasses poured, a folder open between them. He looked up when she came in, and there was nothing in his expression that suggested she was anything other than exactly what she was, the most dangerous person in any room she walked into who happened to have agreed, for reasons still under revision, to share his table. She sat down. She picked up her wine. Show me the numbers, she said.